Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tari Nagesh. I'm Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art here at Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. And I'm part of the curatorial team for the 10th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, or APT10 as we call it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Aboriginal lands on which QAGOMA is located and where I live and work, the Turrbal and Jagera people. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and acknowledge that these are lands where sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Nations people on whose land we work across, as well as First Nations people that are participating in this program and joining us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce the APT10 professional engagement series. I'm kind of doing this as a bit of a late ring in on behalf of Dr. Pippa Dixon, the Director of Asia Link Arts, who unfortunately apologises as she's fallen ill and wanted to spare you all coughing down your Zoom link. But I know she's joining us, so get better soon Pippa, and we'll see you at the next session. This is a series of forums conceived by QAGOMA's APT10 curatorial team with our partners Asia Link Arts at the University of Melbourne and developed in collaboration with Griffith Asia Institute. And we're really excited to be collaborating once again with these great partners, with warm thanks to Pippa, Jala and their teams at Asia Link, and Professor Caitlin Byrne, Director of Griffith Asia Institute and her team. These are great friends and colleagues, and really thank them for their continuing support and advocacy of what we do. We're also really pleased to welcome 20 bursary recipients and sincerely thank Westspace in Melbourne for supporting the promotion and distribution of these bursaries. On behalf of all the organisations, we're also extremely grateful for the assistance provided by the Australian Government through the Australia Council, its arts funding and advisory body, for their support of this brand new and different initiative. This series has been developed on the occasion of APT10, which is currently on display here in Brisbane, to delve deeper into some of the art making contexts of the Asia Pacific region and explore issues that we all face together and some of the changing conditions that we're now working under. It's really been designed as an opportunity for artists and art professionals in Australia and across the Asia Pacific to come together and connect. And we're really privileged and somewhat in place of being able to gather here physically. We're really honoured to be able to draw broadly from a real diversity of speakers that have been involved in APT in different ways. So speakers include across the series artists, collaborators, as well as our APT10 interlocutor team. And they're really coming together to contribute a broad and wide range of perspectives. The format for this session will be two 20-minute presentations, a 40 to 45-minute panel discussion, and then this will be followed by a 20-minute series of breakout groups commencing at approximately 4:35 Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time, 3:35 Eastern Standard Time. These breakouts really will offer a chance for you to meet other attendees, and I know many other artists and collaborators and friends and colleagues have joined us from around the world, so a great chance to have a brief breakout discussion and pursue further ideas from the talks. Our speakers will be spread across these breakout sessions, and they'll all be hosted by staff from the partner organisations, with additionally a warm thank you to two friends and colleagues, Dr. Chaitanya Sambrani from the Australian National University and Dr. Wulan Durgantoro from the University of Melbourne, who have kindly agreed to assist in these moderations. The chat will be open throughout the panel, but otherwise questions can be reserved for the breakouts, as there won't be a formal Q&A session immediately following the panel. We've tried to save time with lengthy intros as well, but a PDF of the speakers and the upcoming sessions is attached to Eventbrite. Please note that each session will be video and audio recorded and shared later on YouTube and all of our web platforms. And this session will also include live simultaneous transcription in English for accessibility, which you can turn on and off in your Zoom window. This is the first in a series of 3 forums that will be at the same time, day and time each week. So please register in advance. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague from the APT10 curatorial team, Ruben Kian, Curator of Contemporary Asian Art here at QAGOMA, who will speak to today's session and introduce the speakers. Thank you to you, Rubes.
Thanks so much, Tarun. Yes, my name is Ruben Kian. I'm Curator of Contemporary Asian Art at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, speaking to you today from Turrbal and Yagara country on the banks of the beautiful Maiwar that runs through the city now known as Brisbane in this lovely part of the world. It's my great pleasure to be chairing the first of these 3 forums that have been put together for all the part. And this one's on the theme of visibility and invisibility. The session explores why certain stories are shared and privileged over others, what is seen, what is erased, and who decides what is made visible. Artists and cultural workers included in APT10 challenge these imbalances, addressing power structures at work and the creative ways in which seldom seen stories and art practices are brought into focus. It's my great pleasure to introduce the 2 speakers today, Vicente Diaz and Soms Boparinya, as well as to chair the conversation that follows. And firstly, I'd like to introduce Vince. Vince is an interdisciplinary scholar and a collaborator on the APT10 Air Canoe project. For more details on his bio, do look to the PDF, but I think I'll hand over right now to Vince. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Just doing a quick share real quick. Can you see my screen? Thank you. Hafidez and Kasalelia Michael, Wahoo Vicente Diaz, Gita Dedo Guam, Anpanene Punpe, Kolken Kausen Palkolo Nan Kichi. From Micronesia, born and raised in Guam with lineage to the island of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia, though I'm coming to you by way of Minnesota, the state of Minnesota and the University of Minnesota, American Indian Studies Department. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how the question of visibility and visibility looks from the vantage point of a region, my home region, a region that has forever, it seems, been obscured from the name onto how we're seen. Micronesia, of course, comes from the Greek words micro, which means tiny, and nesos, islands. And one of the things that I'm going to hope to show you is that islands are anything but tiny. But also the question of visibility and invisibility is also problematic in the sense that the question of making visible has long also been shaped within context of colonial discourses, both government and really the representation and the explanation and the sort of normative understanding of what constitutes life, culture, history, peoplehood in our region. And so even the question of making visible our region within a history of invisibility is also problematic. And what's problematic is the terms of recognition, how we're seen. And much of this actually has to do with how islands are understood and how the ocean region has been understood in modern frames. And speaking from the installation in the air canoe exhibit in the APT10, a short video loop that I'm going to show a little later, and an augmented reality mat of shells. I want to show how we can trouble the terms of visibility and invisibility. So there's a famous quote by Henry Kissinger, former national security advisor, who in response to a colleague who was sort of blown away at his callousness about how the United States was just moving really quickly to take the whole region after World War II. And one of the big reasons for taking the region was for nuclear testing. Kissinger's response was, there are only 90,000 people out there who gives a damn. And this really captures the sense of the political valence of being tiny. But what I want to call attention to is the response by, his name was Walter Hickel, who recorded this quote. And he said, quote, we had established military bases in Turkey and Spain without right of eminent domain. What right did we have to invoke eminent domain on Micronesians? They had little enough land of their own, and their very livelihood depended on that land and the surrounding ocean. They wanted to work with us. They told me on Saipan that all they wanted was a voice in our decisions. But Kissinger's answer in Rogers' office was, there was only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? I did. In fact, I was totally shocked by this remark. This seemed to me an inhuman approach to a situation involving human beings. And what I want to do is call attention to what's problematic here in the terms of recognition, not in the terms of how human rights is understood. And ultimately what I want to point out is definitions of what constitutes humanness that underscores rights. And from the vantage point of canoe cultures, we can actually begin to see a radically different idea of what it means to be human. And it's connected to radically different ideas of what it means, what an island is in relation to the ocean. And to the extent that human rights, which is supposed to be our panacea, our saving hope, doesn't recognize these and only privileges a very particular definition of what it means to be humans, we're doomed. Because as you can see, the stakes are big in visibility or the terms of visibility. There's a famous quote by Epeliha Ofa: to remove a people from their ancestral natural surroundings or vice versa, or to destroy their lands with mining, deforestation, bombing, large-scale industrial and urban developments, and the like, is to sever them not only from their traditional sources of livelihood, but also, and much more importantly, from their ancestry, their history, their identity, and from their ultimate claim for legitimacy of their existence. To boil this down, it's basically a claim about who we are, bound up in relation to our relation to water, to land, to sky. And the context of this quote was from an article called Past to Remember that called for us in the Pacific to go to our own traditions to write history. And more specifically, to go to our local ecologies, our understanding of who we are in relation to land, water, and sky for the form of how we tell that story. And in there, we get a sense of what it means to be human through how we understand ourselves. that would be very different from the prevailing notions of what it means to be a human. I'm going to spend about a minute on this book. This is a very important book called Hungry Listening by a guy named Dylan Robinson, a solo art historian trained in opera. This book, the title Hungry Listening, refers to the word for colonizer, for outsiders, that his people, the Stolo people from the Pacific Northwest, gave. And it referred to these settlers who had a voracious appetite for land and for gold. And so the term that was used to refer to them was these hungry people. And let's let this stand for a voracious colonial appetite. And his argument, this book is actually a close reading of the last decade and a half under a policy of recognition and reconciliation in Canada towards its Indigenous people that has pumped in millions of dollars for art and culture. This book looks at music, and especially classical music, its voracious appetite for Indigenous music. So this is a critique of how the state, the colonial state, has hungered for the exoticism and the other, the alterity of nativeness. And his argument is basically that the terms of recognition and reconciliation that has pumped money, had this intense desire for art and culture of Indigenous people, is the new form of colonialism. Because the voracious appetite for Indigenous otherness is not associated with things like recognizing sovereignty, giving land back, reparations, redress, all of that. If anything, it's a sort of buyout. Check this book out if you can, but I'm speaking from this same perspective. I'm calling attention to the problems of recognition and the terms of visibility, particularly for those of us who've been invisible and yearn visibility. I'm cautioning us about the terms of visibility, particularly in our art. Ultimately, the point I want to make is that the question of the question of visibility and desire for art, particularly people who have been rendered invisible, is ultimately a political act. And it's closely tied to colonialism. But I'm not selling art short here. And I like to think that what we did in our art installation speaks to a different way of doing things. Underwriting where Dylan's coming from, and certainly the work that I do, is the primacy of what's now called radical relationalities in the field of critical Indigenous studies. And this is across the Pacific as well as across Turtle Island, North America. In short, radical relationalities has to do with the relations of kinship and reciprocal caregiving and mutual obligations between human, the animate, and the inanimate worlds. The relations of kinship and reciprocal caregiving and mutual obligations between land, water, and sky forms, and between these and humans. So who we are, we understand ourselves as having kinship relation with land, with water, with sky. These are relatives. And the terms of the relations are also about reciprocal caregiving. And what it means to be human, who we are, has everything to do with making good on the terms of those relations, being good relatives, for example. This will turn out to be a radically different way of defining what it means to be human than, for example, understanding humans as individuated beings that have dominion, for example, over nature, that looks at nature as commodities and resources. And most importantly, understanding humanness in terms of private property or public property, property owning beings. And that's the regime that we're in. Rights are very much a part of that regime. So indigenous relationalities and critical native studies offer an alternative epistemology, a way of understanding things, a different ontology, a way we understand what it means to be human ourselves, and axiology, how we do things, up against settler colonial relations and logics of selfhood. One of the ways we see this in Oceania is we can find this quickly in the Marshallese word island. Island is the Marshallese word for island, and it's not a mispronunciation of the word island. I means currents, and it begins from the seafloor, the bottom of the ocean, and it includes currents underneath, but it also includes waves and swells, and then it includes winds, and then all the way up to the movement of the stars. Those are the currents of the eye. And then lest you miss the point, lang means sky. Langit, lang, rangi. Island, that's our island. That's what an island is. It's not a tiny little self-contained thing that is the predominant definition. And so here we have, coming back to Peliao Hau'ofa, a famous essay, Our Sea of Islands, that bade us to rethink how we understand the Pacific. Instead of a sea of little scattered islands, he asked us to look at the Pacific as this more expansive world, and the ocean as connecting rather than separating. No more insularity, no more remoteness. So expansiveness. And this gives, in a way, this has been generative in our field. Everybody talks about expansiveness. And in a way, it has also come at the expense of specificity of place. So one of the things that some of us are beginning to call for is the need for a corresponding counterpoint of contraction. Contraction standing for don't lose sight of this, the local, the specific, the sea, rather than the ocean, or expansiveness and contraction. Expansiveness is the sense of fluidity, anything goes, creativity. Art is expansive. Politics is often seen as restrictive. We needed more attention between the notion of expansiveness and so what I want to do is spend the rest of whatever time I have left illustrating this with the two installations from the Air Canoe exhibit. This is, go ahead and run this. This is a video loop that accompanies one of the exhibits.
To know us properly, you need to know how we got here and how we continue to move through time and space. This is why we still value our canoes, because they connect us to how our ancestors sailed over thousands of miles of ocean, going from island to island without company. Melodies and more are held in our stories about stars, our oldest relatives. Stars point us to where we want or need to go, and they teach us how to tell time. We can say that stars steer us in our voyage on this canoe called Earth.
Okay, and beside my left, and remember this is north, This is the Northern Star. I think I learned about the stars when I was very, very young, maybe in elementary school. Actually, my first travel on a canoe from one island to another island was way back. I don't remember how old I was.
Pafu means to look at and count stars. On a pandanus mat, shells are placed in a circle. The shells represent rising and setting points of select stars around an island or a canoe. And these rising and setting points are useful because they point toward meaningful locations around us.
Tumur came during Lifeng time. No more breadfruit. And people were kind of hungry because they just eat taro from the taro patch, no more breadfruit. It's a famine star, and it's designed for famine. Un means poison. So the fish are eating something that you should watch out for when you go fishing in the month of Un. At the same time, they said you don't catch a lot of ocean fish in that month of Un, because even the big fish, they know the smaller fish they eat will be poisonous. So they don't waste time going out fishing. Stars are associating with waves and with the current. We were sailing from Poloat to Tamadam, and then on our way back, we were then talking stories, but one of the greatest navigator was with us, and he was sleeping. So he was sleeping, and all of a sudden he woke up and said, "You're going wrong direction." So what? We're not heading for Poloat anymore. And just by feeling it, he was sleeping and he felt the way, his body turned around. But even the way the then make himself turn around, he already knew that the direction is not right.
In the islands, we have a saying, the canoe is the people and the people is the canoe. How we steer our canoes, for example. Sometimes you can't tell where the human body ends and where the ocean and sky begin. So too with the body of our islands, which begin from the ocean floor and are made up of currents and waves, winds and clouds, and extend all the way up to the stars. Stars that teach us everything: direction, time, seasons, and how seasons connect us to birds and to fish and to trees, like the breadfruit trees that our canoes are made from. Canoes whose own bodies connect land, water, sky, and people. For the canoe is the people, and the people is the canoe.
So I can wind this down in about 2 more minutes. I wanted to show you a second installation in the air canoe, and it features that Pafu mat that you saw there, we commissioned a mat and the model canoe over here. But what we did was, and these are fine arts. The canoe culture is a science and it's an art. It's also a philosophy. But what we did was we also partnered with my colleague in computer engineering, Dan Keefe. And I wanted to end with actually a partnership between traditional art and science of seafaring and an art and science of virtual reality. This is a program that draws from a wide array of data, seeing traditional seafaring as a kind of data, but also looking at visual technology as a kind of culture. So we're troubling the categories. And what's really key, important here is the relationship we're building with each other, such as to use each other's arts and sciences to redefine processes of making. This is what we had hoped to achieve. Initially, we wanted to have either headsets so that you're looking at the map and you have this augmentation of a canoe and stars rising and setting. And we came up with a few technical difficulties and so had to resort to projection. So we couldn't achieve that full effect of the stars rising and setting. We decided to project it onto this to the mat. And in doing so, something interesting happened. The perspectives and the scale began to shift and occur simultaneously. So on the mat, what you saw was the sky, a 24-hour day. So when it's night, you see the stars rising and setting, but we projected it onto the mat. So it's like on the ocean, but that's not a problem because the ocean, like swells, for example, are proxies of the stars. So, so there's a relationship between the ocean and the sky. They mirror each other. But when the sun rises, and this is actual data, this is an actual swell coming from the west, Milep. The sun rises, and this is a sped up, this is about a minute of a 24-hour day, that's the ocean. If you look at this, you think you're looking from bird's eye view, but it also looks like you're looking at it from the bottom of the ocean floor, right? You're looking up to the bottom of the canoe. Let me just read this and these 3-4 paragraphs to end. This is what we began to take stock of when we produced this. Augmenting PAFU. Augmented, adjective, to complement and expand upon. At the center of the traditional PAFU mat from Polowatt is a voyaging canoe which we augment with projected rays of light to represent the cycle of one Polowatt day to capture multiple perspectives and scales. That's really key. Knowledge, noun, what and how we know to be true. One perspective is of a celestial simulation that is anchored to shells that traditionally represent rising and setting stars and their trek across the sky. Though we see what navigators see as they sit on a canoe and look up, the projection falls on the mat below. As the sun rises and stars morph into waves, that's the waters of the Trip Lagoon. This perspective is also with a bird overhead or further from outer space, but is also of fish and other marine beings beneath the canoe. Reality, keeping things real. The augmented Pafu mat adds a second-person perspective to that of time. If you circle the mat, you will also see another projection, a swell that comes from rising Altair. As the sun sets and stars rise, the sail's shadow lengthens, then disappears, for we also aspire for the effect of the real. Augmented reality, this is now our definition as a result of putting these together. Projection as a mixed reality medium invites us to meditate on our relationship to place by presenting reality through multiple perspectives and different scales. Augmenting engineering with ancient indigenous canoe knowledge allows us to ponder how rootedness in place and routedness through mobility inform ways of knowing through distinct worldviews. Wisdom, noun, seeking good by innovating on time-honored knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince. There was a lot in that, which I will try to draw out during the discussion. I'd now like to move along in the interest of time to our next presentation by Som Supaparinya, of course, an artist in APT10 with a quite extraordinary installation, Collapsing Clouds Form Stars, currently resident in Berlin, but usually a resident in Chiang Mai. I'll let her speak to it.
Greeting from Berlin. This is Som Supaparinya. I'm so glad and thanks so much to having me as part of the APT10 and inviting me to give a presentation today. For me, there is two kinds of visibility, the objective and subjective approach. And for me, it's important both ways. It's very different, but quite important. Because when we seeing something, we can buy from a lack of knowledge background, and somehow because there is nothing left that help us to learn about it on site. Because of this, I think it's useful to understand the complexity of some events or stories by reading or listening to it and see the event from far. Because sometimes the distance allow me to think and link an invisible structure of the incidents. But in another hand, to sense it by my own perception directly on site also give an experience to see something more than what is appeared and what story that has been told, which often you find something on the site more than you can expect it. Both opposite methods are quite hard to practice actually at the same time. But I would say that it will give a lot of dimension to look at. I would like to introduce my practice by starting with a selection of my previous work that relate to this conversation. And I would like to choose the first work that is quite a turning point for myself because it's the time I start to interest in history and politics, and also have a lot of questions about the untold story that the main media did not provide me. This work is called Shooting Stars, which I made in 2010. The work actually responded to mainstream media that distorted their report of a massacre of the red shirt, or the pro-democracy group when they occupied the center of financial area in Bangkok in 2010. They protested in the day and slept on the street at night. Many nights at the place, they were killed by unidentified black suit men, hid themselves on high buildings, and used a laser gun to fire the protesters' head and shot them. The work showed how easy media can manipulate their visual and sound by turning a camera on a side and use partly sounds from the act of shotguns. I watched it, the media reported in the story, but then the next day the news was converted to say nothing happened. This was a time I noticed that the freedom of media was under control. And so that time, most people went to Facebook or social media to find out the truth that was missing in the main media. The next work I want to show here is the installation in the public area in Chiang Mai, and it's called White Shadows. White Shadows is 7 figures, reflective figures of prisoners of conscience who executed and prosecuted on charge of Her Majesty Article 112 in Thailand. The Article 112 and its use posed a serious threat to the right of freedom of expression. Unfortunately, the prisoner became invisible in the main media and public. In this work, I created their figure quickly on dark public corner in Chiang Mai, where cars or motorbikes, the light from cars or motorbike can shine to them only when they pass by. And without the light shining onto their figure, you can't really notice their figure because it's the same color as the background. The next works I want to show here is my first video works that research on landscape and riverscape. This work with my curiosity about my grandpa's life. I follow his trading route on a pink river, which he used to travel to Bangkok. But the river in my town was not anymore possible to travel the same way. And the reason is because of the dam. a big dam. And that work, this work, triggered me to produce two following works on the impact of electricity generation to environment and how the consumer of electricity also part of the impact of the work. After this work, I produced 10 places in Tokyo while I'm staying at Tokyo Wonder Site in 2012, which before that, 2011, I also was in Tokyo. But this work actually is kind of look at the incident in the distance way. And because of that, I can see the relationship of atomic bomb in Hiroshima at the end of the World War II. It was the same technology of nuclear use that used as electricity generation in Japan as a source of disaster in Fukushima. And it's linked to the main electricity consumer in Tokyo, which I emphasize here as an important role of the theater as well. It shows the dual function of the atomic technology as weapon and electricity, which can use either way at any time. That's the most dangerous part. It's not only what already happened in Japan, but you see the true function of it. And in the same time, I also produced this work. It's called When Need Moves the Earth. It's focused on the two large-scale electricity generation in Thailand that sit on active fault lines, which created man-made earthquake. One station using coal mine called lignite, and the other produced hydroelectricity from a river. The work take audience to access how each station operates and how the less visible yet quite weak landscape has been reshaped. Although this active fault line on the landscape can be seen, but because it's too enormous strip on the earth, it's quite hard for us humans to see them at once. So in this video, actually, I try to capture different evidence of the earth, the sensitivity of the earth that possible to create man-made earthquake, as well with the operation of the electricity generation. The last two videos is my new works. I just finished both of them in December last year. It's called Two Sides of the Moon. is about the life of fishermen at the beginning and the ending area of the Moon River, where it joins the Mekong River as Thai-Laos border. And each location faced to the change of the riverscape by man-made dam. But their story and how it's impact to their life is very, very opposite. One community started to learn how to fish, and the other counting names of extinct fish and tools. So the concept in the works of light and darkness is derived from the moon, the character of the moon, that it shines and shades, give the very contrast destiny of the two sides of the river. And I would like to show you a short clip of the videos.
มีทุกอย่างเลยฟ้าส่วนมากมีทุกอย่าง
This is a work that show at the APT10. It's called Collapsing Crown, Form Starts. It's my pilgrimage to these 24 locations across the country. And each place resonant the resistant memory and spirit of the commoners who fought for their rights, for their identity. It was an attempt to be there in person, to feel the reaction from this surrounding and how the surrounding look at me. Those mundane places looking, and the way to get there told me the sensitivity of the place. As a woman, I standing about 1 or 2 hours at mostly unusual places with a professional camera and tripod. I could measure myself that I felt something with my surrounding, and the local would also feel something. I think we felt something because we both might have heard or experienced the event that perhaps has been taking place here, or maybe other situation that happening around there. Our memory interferes us to feel something which our eyes perhaps don't see it. While at the places in more distance and subjective way, what we could see just a mundane, rundown or well-protected places, which has perhaps no evidence or memory to hold any crucial memory of the people. Seeing just that landscape won't get any clue of the past. The memory that attacked with the sight will be soon washed out and become only a region. The selected 24 resistant events or their dead places actually reflect the less belonging of their power in this country. However, their intangible expression as a language, as a verbalization, finds the way to survive. Even it's not widely known. With this work, I collected 279 people expressions which motivated the political movement in the past until now. I have collected them and keep them in tangible form of embroidery ribbons. The number of the ribbons are the same number of the Thai constitutional law. That's why I choose this number. The collected these expressions often from unconventional sources, such as banned books, protest signs, community and event signs, protest signs, social media status, lyrics, poems, and speeches, all in all, in the location and language of these political strife and threats have made people remember and inspire the next generation to use them as a case study for the further negotiation to end the conflict. Lastly, I think it's important to feel the vibration of the site in order to see the different angle, different narrative that existing, but perhaps missing in our perception.
Thank you to Som for that presentation. We're going to move on to the panel discussion section of this program today. I'm joined by 4 very esteemed collaborators and artists, all of whom have been involved with APT10 in one way or another. We have 2 of our interlocutors, Carol Yinghua Liu, who is the director of the Inside Out Museum in Beijing, and Linkoni Vakatu, who's also an artist, an academic, an educator, very multifarious practice. And 2 of our APT10 artists, Pala Potapitiye, coming to us from Sri Lanka today, and Brian Fuata, who's been moving between Sydney and Brisbane for APT10 and since then. Just looking very, very briefly at those first 2 speakers, I noticed obviously there's different forms of interpretation that this idea of visibility allows. And I think that's characteristic of it being a metaphor, primarily a visual metaphor for what is commonly discussed, interpreted, experienced, and what may not be. It was interesting that Som proposed these 2 different kinds of visibility that are in play together, the objective and the subjective, which has to do with a position of perspective where one is seeing something from. And also this idea of relationality that Vince proposed. And I do see a certain overlap between those 2 ideas, the relationality between the seer and what is seen, and the relative positions between the 2 of them. We're talking about what are we making visible, or what is invisible. We're talking about peoples, we're talking about regions, we're talking about narratives, we're talking about histories and practices. And I wanted to speak firstly to Carol, in particular, talking about making artist practices visible through various platforms, through your work at the museum, also through your curatorial practice with Liu Ding. One of the things that you've done in your work is to reframe histories of Chinese contemporary art, and also to reframe the perspectives in terms of where people are looking at things, and also how to broaden the discussions. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you've used, as well as some of the challenges that you've encountered there. Oh, so I think Carol's gone a little bit quiet, just on the mute there. I might move on to Paula. Paula, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ruben. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of what you've done in your practice is to look at some of these histories and narratives, and a kind of a reworking of the visual form, particularly of cartography, which is a very sort of a colonial way of looking at territories, and to interrupt it in your practice. And you know, looking back at what Vince said, a lot of what we are talking about when it comes to regimes of visibility and invisibility is a legacy of the colonial. So I'd love to hear more about how you address that in your work.
Yeah. You know that I'm trying to explore my idea, and within my experience in the country, that we have been colonized by British more than 100 years now. So, but people we be talking about the British colonization mostly. But what I found when I see the history and introducing to the Buddhism to our country by the Emperor Ashoka from India, and that was the first colonial experience what we had here. But people are not talking about this thing because of, I think the Buddhism has come from this from India, introduced by the Emperor Ashoka, and I see that the whole process also like it's totally colonization, because they have changed our cultural practice and our belief system and administrative system at the time. And then also I'm talking about the British colonization, which has influenced a lot into the culture and the politics and all that in the country. So, you know that I'm from a traditional dancing family, and my father is a ritualist and ritual artist. And this tradition is, before the British comes, it was a very rich tradition, right? And that my father, he has been studying this tradition and reading, writing, and all kind of art forms. And, you know, but when the British colonized us, so these kind of art traditions, they marginalized as a craft or low art or primitive art. So then what happened was that along with this marginalization, they have introduced us to this archaeology, anthropology kind of subject. So they are here to say that my tradition that I belong doesn't have a contemporary values. It has only the historical values. So, and at the same time, so how powerful this cultural colonization is, so they ask us to marginalize our tradition ourselves. So that's what I see. And also that you know that we have the Dutch conquering and the Portuguese, and then the British has colonized totally the country. So this is the trade and the colonization, they goes together. And especially this my work, I have taken the cartography, and then I rework on the cartography. And some of the images are overlapping again and again. and also some, and as well as some of the images I'm keeping as a colorful image. That is, that I was trying to keep that still that colonial power is empowering us. And the black and white image, I'm just trying to say that the historical memories. And also that you can see that when you see the measurement, idea of measurement is before the cartography, they have used this measurement to measure us. And that our skin color, our how they wear the dress, right? And when you see that we are mostly wearing a lungis, so people who wear the lungis, so when you see that people that they say that they're uncivilized. If you want to be civilized, you have to wear the jeans and the whatever the Western dress, right? And even today, if you come to Colombo city, the Colombo is the main city. There you have all kind of art events and everything happening. And if you talk there with the broken Sinhala, the mother tongue, you will be recognized as a good person because you don't know the language, but the own language, but you know English. But if you speak broken English, you will become the uncivilized man. The people think like that. And also that if you speak very good English with the British or American accent, so you will be the man, and he is a civilized man, an intellectual man. So this is all I found that it's all coming with the colonial influence, and especially the cultural colonization. So those are the things I'm trying to express with my work. And yeah.
That's actually really interesting that you say that there's this kind of question of it's not just about being seen, but about how you're seen by the controlling power and by the legacies of previous powers. Carol's back online, and there was something really interesting that Paula said about forms of making that were seen not as contemporary, but as historical, even though they're being performed now. So to get back to the question of the kind of work that you've been showing, Carol, and the kind of artists that you've been working with, have you been confronted by this question of interpretation of whether an artist is seen as being of contemporary relevance or as merely historical, particularly when working with senior figures like you have?
Yeah, actually, I'm taking contemporary. Okay. Yeah, I'm talking about the contemporary experience of myself, and then I'm trying to understand what happened. That that in my country, mostly in Asia, we have a caste system, right? The low caste and high caste, and I'm belong to the low caste. Who are the people that my caste is specialist for the 9 kind of different the craft making, right? And the ritual, the wood carving, stone carving, goldsmith, metalsmith, etc. Right? So then I found the people who do this kind of the art practices, they marginalize as the low caste people, right? Even in the school, I have been in a difficult time because of this. I born into this the lower caste family, and I've been marginalized by my own people here, right? So then I was thinking of why is this happen? Who has told that we are primitive or not that the what you call the Western artists, like fine artists. Yeah. So they say our works are unfine. If you want to be again civilized or fine, you have to follow this Western art practices.
I like this term, unfine. I might let Carol respond now. That's all right, Pa?
Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, sure.
Okay, Carol.
Thanks. Sorry about the technical mishap. What I want to say is actually like Paula, the kind of motivation for us to revisit historical instances, historical facts, and historical narratives in China really arise from the kind of challenges that we encounter as practitioners in the field. And basically in China, the kind of framework, the perspective on contemporary art and the historical narrative of contemporary art in China emerged after 1989. And that means that this framework is very much influenced by a Eurocentric view of art history, as well as in China, in particular, the narrative of revolutionary mindset and also the narrative of modernization, meaning that it constantly emphasizes ruptures with previous movements, previous periods of time, previous canons of practices, and also emphasizing on the new, replacing the old. So that really is the kind of underlying value and underlying mindset in terms of creating a narrative of contemporary in China after 1989. But in our practices, in our encounters with artists, with historical facts, we have found that such a narrative really doesn't tell the whole story about the real art historical cause. But this narrative is very dominant. It's repeated again and again, and it becomes a kind of a hegemony. And it's also very much kind of conformed by art markets that resize and recognize certain master figures, masterpieces in such a narrative. But this is a very oversimplified and problematic narrative. And this narrative determines what's visible and what's invisible. That's a very kind of dominant challenge. And on the other hand, we recognize the fact that we understand that each of us in this field is part of the mechanism that creates the narrative or kind of forms the narrative that gives power to this narrative. So we have found that the best way is to go back to historical facts, to go back to artists who have been through these different historical periods, and to understand what they really went through and what were the historical facts that were left out by this oversimplified art historical narrative. So we found art history in a way a very useful approach in terms of expanding and revising the existing narrative, in terms of bringing more practices and more thinking into this framework. In the meantime, the kind of narrative or understanding of art in China since 1989 has also very much based on the kind of superficial forms, the visual languages. It really goes back to the intellectual motivations, the intellectual kind of context that mobilize certain artistic practices. So that is also a kind of awareness we are bringing into the art historical narrative, that art history is not only about certain canons of art forms, but actually is a constant kind of flow of ideas and how these ideas resonate with kind of contemporary ideas simultaneously. And one important thing is that in China, the current kind of consensus or impression is, like I said, informed by post-89 kind of perspective, meaning that contemporary in China is considered to begin after the end of the Cultural Revolution. But in our understanding and study, this is not true. In China, the kind of ideological framework was really set already in the 1940s, and it has never changed. So this really also changed the kind of definition and understanding of contemporary art and contemporaneity in China. So this is something that we have also been working on very closely in terms of analyzing how the kind of characteristics that define contemporary in China that doesn't really correspond to the contemporary art, the so-called contemporary art that's understood globally.
I mean, it's really interesting because you're talking about a situation where there is almost this kind of super visibility for a mode of practice that is approved by the hegemonic discourse. I want to turn now to Lincoln, and in a context where there's very little visibility for artists and practices outside of your local context. We've spoken a lot about visibility, but I'm kind of interested now to look at some of the challenges and possibilities of invisibility. Would you be able to respond to that?
Yes, I'm speaking from the smaller island nations in terms of our invisibility. It's part of our invisibility for the contemporary art is partly our doing, and it's also part from the bigger nation. Let me get into it. When you look at contemporary Pacific art, what the world sees is mostly come from diaspora. I'm not judging, I am just saying it is what. So those artists, contemporary artists who live in the smaller island nation get totally invisible to the outside world. Who get to represent our island nation in the world comes from diaspora. So when the world sees contemporary Pacific art, they either go to New Zealand or Australia. But I'm glad that this year was different for APT10. It was like Ruth and the teams has purposefully go out into the islands to bring artists from the island. It was very different. It wasn't the first time, but this year they really tried to really go out to the island. I'm so glad for Ruth and the team for the Pacific to really consciously go to the island instead of going to diaspora. I'm not saying that is bad, because to me this is a small island phenomenon. It's like you don't see India going to Australia looking for diaspora Indian to represent India. You don't see that in China or the Philippines. This is more like a small island thing. When the world sees a contemporary Pacific island thing, they go outside. So you don't go to Kiribati, But one of the things of part of our invisibility is because we haven't developed our institution for the arts, that I'm sure look at APT10, when the curators for the Pacific scour the internet looking for artists, there is no discourse. Basically, because of the smallness of islands and the art institutions are not developed. I mean, I don't blame them. They'll try their best, but they have to go to where the discourse is available. And part of the solution for others is to migrate. They have to migrate to New Zealand or Australia, or apart from Kiribati and Micronesia, they go to America. And there they can be visible, they can be represented, they can be picked. So that is part of our invisibility, and part of what we're trying to do is to create discourse to change that narrative. It's like my mentor, Apeli always says, when you go to school, they always tell you we have small islands, small markets, small populations. They concentrate on our smallness because of economic activity, but we never define ourselves with smallness of our land by the bigness of our ocean. That's how we define it. We are people of the sea, you always thought. So I'm trying at the moment to change that mindset, to develop discourse for that. And I'm glad, we are partly invisible because we haven't developed it, but because in terms of representations, we are not represented. We have to migrate. The solution for us is to migrate some of our artists, migrate to New Zealand, to bigger countries in order to be picked, to be represented for the world for us. And also our market is small in terms of economic, is true. But the type of art that we do not really, what the art world is looking at in the small islands. We concentrate mainly because the market is determined by tourism, whatever sells the most. So it contributes, people concentrate on the smallness now, bread and butter, livelihood issues. But then, a lot of our artists migrate. That's in order to be seen or be visible, we have to move to bigger spaces, bigger market. That's what I say.
I mean, what you're saying, obviously, about the kind of diasporic condition and that representation, it does give me a very easy cue to talk to Brian. But before I do that, I want to ask you about what that migration does to local arts ecologies. Is there like ongoing communication, or do you feel that you lose certain practitioners who move away?
Yeah, it's both. There is some communication. Some artists come back, but I feel like it's for their own reason. It's like, you have to go back to the island to legitimize your. But and we lose most of the artists. Some of them, like, they do well. I mean, I don't blame them, because of my interest in academia, I want to stay and develop that discourse, but I don't blame artists who migrate. They have better opportunity. They have access to help. I mean, to live in New Zealand alone is to have access to funding. You can apply to Creative New Zealand to fund a trip, to publish, to do all that type of help. To live in the island is like you're more or less a jack of all trades. You have to market yourself. You have to do everything by yourself. When you go to New Zealand, if you want to develop an artist reputation, or even in Australia, to be a gallery represented artist, you don't do much of the work. You just paint or make sculpture. They do most of the discourse writing, Yeah. So I always call it, we operate in a bicycle system. You have to move into a truck system to enjoy the benefit of that, to be visible. So I call our art system a bicycle system. Yeah. And then you have to go to a truck system in order to access to those benefits.
Thanks,
yeah.
So as Brian, as somebody who's working in the truck system, but also as an artist who deals very much with this kind of movement between the visible and the invisible in your performances as the ghost, working with these metaphors in a very obvious ways. What are your thoughts on some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I was kind of like similar to Vincent, wanting to kind of sort of problematize this kind of the binary of the visible and the invisible, and open it up to a kind of polarity by which these two concepts can coincide with each other and produce kind of sort of strategies of recuperation. And so closer to Lingoni's point around kind of sort of like the diasporic kind of sort of supremacy by which the islands are represented, I guess for me, I was like thinking about how that trajectory from kind of sort of like the islands into this kind of market forces that Carol is speaking about related to the kind of hegemonic kind of center. What does that transference do, well, that migration, in that to maintain the kind of like agency of our Indigenous practices without being co-opted or captured by some kind of like visible mechanism that engenders signification to qualify our indigeneity. And so then I was thinking about, in terms of coming from a diasporic position, and as a maker, how my disconnection to Samoa is invisible to me, and how the kind of like that in my improvisations where I use the ghost, the spaces by which culture, Samoan culture, kind of sort of does appear is through this live relational space. And that kind of like qualifies its authenticity, an authenticity project that's also kind of sort of like determined by these kind of colonial ideas of site and qualification. I think, yeah, I mean, I guess in that sense, I'm kind of sort of like playing around with these different polarities. And so in my improvisation performances, I quite often move from these different registers of public speaking and relations between myself and the staff of the whatever institution, as well as the audience, and blur this line between being watched and performing. And so quite often, like, the audience become complicit to both the to various kind of sort of registers of kind of sort of being. So it could be like a poetic kind of sort of rhapsody to just informationally speaking about, you know, the parameters of the performance. So for example, to make sense, I will make visible the structure of the performance. And so that kind of aids the audience to kind of sort of be aware of what's going to happen. And in this categorization, kind of sort of expand upon what their expectations of the, you know, announcement of the structure of the live moment. But my brain is coming sort of going crazy because there are so many things with what Vincent had said and what Carol, everyone, included also like Som's idea around this kind of like idea of vibration. And a vibration kind of, if we frame it within this sensorial idea of sight, it expands upon what we think about sight, the possibilities of sight. And that there is this constant flipping. I love the idea of like Vincent's idea of like this, the sea from that Marshallese context, the definition of the Marshallese, and then connecting that to Ebeli's idea of the Sea of Islands. So it becomes this, like the sea of the currents of the sky. So there's this wide expanding kind of sort of notion that also expands upon what we assume to be a binary opposition of visibility and invisibility. It becomes so poetic, and poetic offering a kind of sort of a political way of navigating ourselves and our practices.
I mean, I think it's actually good because I mean you're bringing this conversation back to art. I'm just going through a note that I took down from Vincent's presentation. It was this idea of art as a different way of doing things, and that's fundamentally why we're here, right? This is the stock that we trade in. This is the field that we work in, and I suppose we have investments in it. I apologize for my financial metaphors now, but we have interests in this field because of the ways that it can help us negotiate some of these frameworks. And we've talked about some of these hegemonies, colonial structures, Eurocentric viewpoints, the location of marketplaces, which may be away from somebody's home, the pressures of caste and class, and I think, you know, these kind of questions of discipline. Staying with this theme of art, I wanted to ask Pala again, as another artist in APT, if you'd had any more thoughts, you know, based on the conversation so far about these issues.
Yeah, so you know that actually that again, if I take this my tradition which I belongs to, and actually that the conceptuality is the invisible. You know that the colonial education system has created the idea of invisible, this kind of tradition. But though it is visible, so they're trying to make this all through colonial education system and all that, that kind of traditions invisible. And that's why I'm saying that earlier also that this colonial subject like that archaeology and anthropology kind of subject, they are saying that has a historical value, not the contemporary value. In the contemporary, they are trying to invisible this kind of the tradition. And at the same time that you have, you know, that we had a 30 years war in Sri Lanka between Sinhalese and Tamil. And this war was actually the mainly I found this is, you know, the colonial ideology, the idea that which after we start institutions here in the country and we go to the school, and at the school we start learning this kind of idea, like, you know, that the racism, nationalism, etc. And so to those the colonial education system has created this kind of that local art traditions and the people's cultural practice to be invisible, though it is visible. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the things that are in plain sight, but because they're not designated as contemporary, then,
Yes,
then they become invisible.
Those kind of art practices. Also, you can see that especially if you take my traditions, my father and their people, they practice this art practices of their traditional art practice. So, but they work for the community, not the gallery or the to sell or something. So they are working for the community, to heal the community, right? And not for the money. So this tradition has a very rich idea and conceptual idea. You know that if you take the tradition, it has all kind of art forms like dancing, singing, drama, and all kind of art, architect, and all the art forms in one ritual ceremonies. So this is very rich tradition, and also that to invisible these traditions, and even the colonial scholars, they said this is just like folk art or whatever like that. So they written in the book, and we read this book, and then also we are trying to invisible ourselves, our own rich traditions. So that's what I see with this colonial influence. What happened to our the tradition in the contemporary. Yeah.
Good, thank you. I'm just looking at the time here. We've got a couple of minutes before we go into the breakouts, and so I just wanted to ask very quickly for some last comments from each of you. So from Carol, any thoughts in regard to these questions?
Not really, but I guess I just also want to say that we easily assign kind of authority, a sense of authority to many things in our trade, in our field. But when you think again, a lot of the kind of authority that we assign doesn't really stand. So it's really a very interesting kind of thing to bear in mind when we assume certain things, such as our history, that carry that authority. We should also bring in the agency of each of our individuals in terms of kind of changing that dynamic.
Thank you. There's actually a really interesting comment from Vince in the chat as well, responding to your discussion of art history and about breaking out of colonial forms of historical knowledge that I draw everybody's attention to. Lincoln, any thoughts?
I'm just saying in terms of from us in smaller islands, it's a struggle of contemporary artists, not with our traditional heritage dance. That's stuff we know that. Each got its own stuff. When it comes to contemporary art, we are struggling with that because in economic is small market, but it's also the discourse. The discourse for the contemporary art people hasn't articulated more to understand what contemporary art is. Let me give you an example. In Tonga, the traditional dancing for women, you cannot lift your foot above your knee, all right, for women. So translated to contemporary dancing, where you lie down, you lift your legs up in the air and roll, that's a big taboo and no in Tongan culture. So contemporary art is really struggling with the cultural protocol, but it's also, that's why a lot of artists migrate in order to express themselves in terms of that. So in other places where, you cannot comment on politics, a lot of artists know that, like you have to migrate before you go in. A lot of artists here in Fiji cannot do political art. It's a lot of artists say, I'm not going to risk it, so I'm not doing it. So yeah, a part of that, the discourse is important, and we're trying to build that so that our people understand contemporary art. you know, because the way our people look at art is like, you fail academia, so academic studies, so you become an artist. So we don't, yeah. Our traditional artists, we value them because we fit into them. Our contemporary artists, we sort of, fail school, you can be an artist. The mentality towards artists hasn't changed. So in order to convince our people, because the idea, there's an idea called usefulness. It's in our usefulness. That idea, you have to articulate the discourse in terms of, it's called in Tonga, it's aonga in Fijian. You know, even you as a student, you go to university, you are not for yourself. You come back for your family, your extended family, your village, your church. Then you are called, you are useful as now. Then you are a man for your village. So contemporary art, the discourse in the island, I'm trying to build usefulness into contemporary art. Why is it? But for money, once you talk money, people's eyes open. But you know, to fit that discourse and that narrative, as you guys have talked about, our people have to understand it. And we got 3 universities here in Fiji: University of Fiji, National University, the University of South Pacific, which is regional. No art discourse coming from those, nothing, nada. So yeah, we have to, a lot of the art activities in the islands are driven by artists themselves. So yes, so hopefully the discourse and the usefulness of it can be, so that people understand contemporary art, develop the market, or else, just like everybody else, I'm going to migrate. So yes, migration is there. Thank you.
Thanks, Linkoni. And Brian, I'm going to give you 1 minute.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, I mean, the question of utility is like such a fascinating ongoing conversation, especially in regards to, I mean, just generally, but that cultural specificity, Lingone, is like totally true. And it's something that, like, say, a lot of my Pacifica friends also deal within their practice in terms of how utility can be described in, or I don't know, explained and framed in a way that our community can understand, right? In terms of its like efficacy. But I also think about Carol's point around agency and, what was it? Is it you're saying you're talking about agency and authority?
Authority, yeah.
Yeah, and how we kind of sort of like operate between this space within these contexts, and kind of express the, you know, this, again, this polarity of being seen and not being seen, and how we can kind of sort of subvert these 2 aspects of, you know, representation.
Thank you for that. There's obviously a lot more to talk about. We're going to go into breakout rooms now, and so you're all going to be assigned randomly into these rooms. So there'll be slightly smaller rooms, but this is a place where everybody, all of the extended participants in this program can join in the conversation. Those will run for so roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll come back just for some final comments to wrap it up. The guidelines for the breakout rooms, importantly, have been posted in the chat. There's just some basic etiquette notes about mic usage and other things like that. So do take a quick look at those and be respectful. Very nice. So I look forward to getting into a conversation. We'll be having people leading these and then all coming back together very soon. So thank you very much, especially to the speakers and to the participants in this panel discussion today. Thank you. Hey, if everybody can hear me after that jump cut, well, I'm sure we're all having some really great conversations. I'd like to say thank you again to everybody involved, to Vince and Som as our speakers, to Carol, to Paula, to Linkoni and Brian, who participated in the discussion, to everybody who helped share and participate in the breakout rooms. That was really fantastic. And particular thanks to the team working behind the scenes here at AsiaLink to keep this rather complicated technical operation moving seamlessly, really. Also to everybody out there who's listening, I will draw your attention. Do check out the PDF that was shared in the chat. There's some information about our forthcoming programs. Those are going to be the same time next week and the week following. If you can register via Eventbrite, it's the best way of getting the information where the link is. A lot more presentations, a lot more conversations to come. I feel that we didn't get anywhere near having the full conversations here today, so there'll be a lot more to talk about then. But thanks again, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you again next week.